He expected everyone to admire his new Jaguar. Instead, students muttered about him behind his back. To humiliate their self-important headmaster, 3 students slipped out under cover of darkness, and filled a balloon with white paint. They attached the balloon to an air hose, and hung it above the headmaster's reserved parking spot. Charlie and George happened to witness the setup. Just as they spoke, an elderly teacher came down the path. George quickly stepped forward to distract her, and buy the pranksters a little more time. Working under pressure, the 3 boys finished setting the trap, but as they hurried away, they made enough noise to draw attention. The teacher heard something nearby, but chose not to investigate. The next morning, as usual, Trask carefully guided his Jaguar into the parking space reserved for him. Just as he was about to walk away, an announcement over the school intercom stopped him. At first, the broadcast praised Trask, and grandly described how he had supposedly earned the Jaguar. Students across campus stopped to listen, quietly enjoying the spectacle. Meanwhile, one prankster at the controls slowly opened the air valve. The balloon began to inflate, and the announcement suddenly changed, mocking the way Trask had received the car. The accusations struck directly at Trask's vanity, and humiliated him before the whole school. With everyone watching, he pulled a key from his pocket, and tried to puncture the balloon above him, but it was hanging too high, so he climbed onto the car door and stretched upward. The instant the balloon burst, white paint crashed down like a fountain. The headmaster and his prized Jaguar were drenched from top to bottom. The scene became a public spectacle, and the students erupted in cheers. For the students, the prank briefly released years of resentment toward Trask, while cutting straight through his pride. Furious and embarrassed, the headmaster vowed to identify those responsible, and make the culprits pay. Charlie and George had both seen the boys preparing the prank. Trask summoned them to his office, and demanded that they uphold Baird's honor by identifying the culprit, but George firmly denied seeing anything. Charlie was torn between protecting his future and refusing to become a snitch. When both students remained silent, Trask chose a more aggressive approach. He scheduled a school-wide hearing for Monday, and ordered every student to attend. In front of the entire school, he intended to expose the culprit. He then issued an ultimatum. If no one confessed before the hearing, George and Charlie, as the witnesses, would both face expulsion. Trask then dismissed George, and tried to use his authority to pressure Charlie into naming names. He asked Charlie whether he knew whom Baird would recommend to Harvard. He implied that recommendation could go to Charlie if he cooperated and named the boys to a scholarship student. The offer could transform his life. Charlie still refused to identify anyone. He remained quiet but firm. When Charlie still refused to bend, he told him to spend Thanksgiving break to think very carefully about his choice. The warning was clear. If he did not change his mind, the consequences could destroy his future. Charlie left deeply conflicted. He knew this choice could decide his education and his future, while putting his conscience on trial. Outside, George noticed Charlie wavering, and warned him not to reveal anything. George insisted that Baird boys followed an unwritten rule against informing on classmates. They were expected to stay silent, and keep their parents out of it. George asked Charlie to call him that evening. By then, George claimed he would have a solution. Charlie agreed, but kept wondering how to preserve his conscience without destroying everything he had worked for. Most Baird students came from wealthy families. Money and connections shielded them from consequences. Even after serious misconduct, Charlie came from a modest family in Oregon. His mother and stepfather ran a convenience store. His grades, financial aid, and scholarship were the only reasons he could attend Baird. With Christmas drawing closer, his anxiety only grew. He missed his family in Oregon, but could not afford the airfare home. The same financial pressure made Trask's threat even more frightening. It also pushed Charlie to look for work over Thanksgiving break. He found a temporary job caring for a retired officer, and hoped the pay would cover a flight home for Christmas. When he arrived at the house, 2 cheerful children answered the door. Charlie assumed the job would be easy enough. Instead, Karen led him to a cottage out back. Inside waited her blind uncle, retired Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade. Before Charlie met him, Karen warned him not to patronize Frank, call him helpless, or grab him without permission. Frank expected respect and control over his own movements. Charlie stumbled almost as soon as he entered. Without thinking, he addressed Frank as Sir. Frank snapped at once, "Call me Frank or Colonel, but don't call me sir." Charlie nodded. Frank then grilled him about Baird, his scholarship, and his family's finances. The questions hit a sensitive subject, but Charlie answered honestly. Frank quickly understood Charlie's financial position. Even with aid, Baird cost far more than Charlie's family could comfortably afford. That made him especially vulnerable at school. When Charlie finally pushed back, Frank exploded and ordered Charlie out. His cutting words and cold manner made him question whether he could accept the job. Charlie doubted himself and wondered whether he could manage Frank. Karen explained that no one else had applied, and that the two-day job paid $300 because she truly needed someone. Charlie reconsidered, needing money for the flight home. He reluctantly accepted the job. What he did not know was that this short assignment would become a defining experience in his life. As soon as Karen's family drove away, Frank ordered Charlie to bring out his luggage. Frank had lost his sight, but he remained fiercely independent and acutely aware of everything around him. He checked each detail for himself before declaring they were ready. Charlie instinctively reached out to guide him, but Frank stopped him sharply. Charlie had not yet understood that Frank wanted dignity and autonomy, not to be treated like a helpless child. Frank's secret destination was New York City, a world of luxury, freedom, and possibility. He had quietly bought one ticket for himself and another for Charlie, both in first class. At the airport, Charlie again tried to take Frank's arm, and Frank reprimanded him again. After enduring so much hostility, Charlie was starting to dislike him. That judgment would soon become more complicated. As the plane cruised above the clouds, a flight attendant moved down the aisle, offering drinks to the passengers. Charlie's attention shifted back to Frank. He wondered how Frank knew so much about the flight attendant without ever seeing her. Frank's awareness fascinated him. Charlie began to understand how much experience Frank carried. Without sight, he relied on voice, scent, memory, and concentration. Frank said only two things could still stir his blood: women, especially their scent, and Ferrari sports cars. Both represented the life he still craved. A Ferrari promised a sense of speed, power, and freedom, and reminded him of the man he once was. Through Frank, Charlie began to experience the world through a different set of senses, and notice details he had always overlooked. New York's skyline appeared in the night. A limousine carried them to the Waldorf Astoria. The famous hotel offered exactly the elegance Frank wanted from this trip. For him, the Waldorf was almost familiar territory. He had stayed there before, and still remembered its layout. Frank had arranged everything: a stretch limousine, reservations at an expensive restaurant, and the remaining details of the trip. Charlie, however, remained deeply uneasy. He wanted to return to Baird, where the disciplinary hearing still awaited him. Frank refused to let him leave yet. He insisted Charlie eat first, and used his practiced charm to draw Charlie into the evening. Charlie saw through some of the performance, but still climbed into Frank's limousine. The comfort and extravagance inside felt completely foreign to him. During the ride, Frank casually arranged to meet an escort later that night. Charlie's expression only grew more troubled. Frank sensed the shift immediately, and asked what was bothering him. After hesitating, Charlie finally explained the situation at Baird. Frank immediately recognized the role of money and status in the conflict. This was not simply truth versus loyalty. Charlie had far more to lose than the wealthy boys. In Frank's cynical view, George and the culprits would be protected by their families and connections. He urged Charlie to name the boys and take Trask's help with Harvard survival. Frank argued, sometimes demanded an ugly compromise. Charlie refused to let the headmaster put a price on his conscience. That answer surprised Frank. Frank still saw him as inexperienced, but began to recognize the strength beneath his uncertainty. The boy was frightened, yet unwilling to sell his principles for advantage. Soon, they entered the elegant oak room. The staff noticed that Charlie's sweater violated the restaurant's dress code. A jacket was immediately brought over and placed around his shoulders so he could remain in the dining room. The menu prices stunned Charlie. A hamburger and fries cost $24. Charlie could hardly believe it. The extravagance made Charlie wonder what Frank was really planning. Back home, Frank lived in a worn cottage behind Karen's house. Now he was spending freely on luxury and ceremony. Charlie could not imagine that Frank's real purpose was to complete one final tour of life, sleep at the finest hotel and enjoy a lavish dinner, visit his older brother, spend a night with a woman, and drive a Ferrari. Once the list was finished, he planned to return to the Waldorf and end his life. Even after revealing the plan, Frank paused to savor a woman's lingering scent. Charlie was horrified by what he he had heard. The intimidating retired officer had turned the trip into his private farewell. Charlie was completely unprepared and did not know how to respond. On the way back, Charlie quietly saluted him. In an awkward gesture of respect, Frank sensed even that small movement and corrected the salute from memory. For a moment, the exchange restored his military identity. It also deepened Charlie's respect. Without making Frank's plan any less dangerous, Charlie now understood that the commanding officer beside him was also a man preparing to die. Luxury had restored no meaning to Frank's life. Every experience was part of a final ritual, not proof that his crisis had passed. Charlie now carried an emergency he never expected. The next morning, Frank carefully chose a suit for a Thanksgiving visit to his older brother. For Frank, the visit was a final family call and another part of his planned farewell. Before leaving, Charlie kept his promise and called George to discuss the hearing. George's position had not changed. If Trask questioned them, they should claim to have seen and heard nothing. Charlie remained uncertain, but reluctantly agreed. Frank listened from nearby, his expression becoming more serious. He knew George would eventually seek his father's protection. If Charlie remained silent, he could be left alone and lose everything he had earned. Frank had arranged a suit for Charlie as well. Together, they headed to White Plains, but when Frank knocked on the door, his nephew greeted him without warmth. Even Frank's own brother showed little pleasure at the visit. To the family, Frank was the guest no one wanted. His arrival disturbed their uneasy peace, but Frank refused to be intimidated by the mood. He embraced his sister-in-law and loudly admired the scent of her hair, stopping only when the family objected. The gesture was intrusive and showed his disregard for other people's boundaries. His brother bluntly asked Charlie why Frank had arrived without warning. Charlie sensed that beneath Frank's bravado lay profound loneliness and a wish for one last family connection. Frank's brother, however, responded with cold indifference and left the room painfully tense. At the dinner table, Frank dominated the conversation. His stories made everyone increasingly uncomfortable. He also provoked Randy with insults about his marriage and work, until Randy struck back. Randy insulted Frank and exposed the ugliest parts of his past. Frank had once been considered for promotion, but insubordination and recklessness destroyed that future. He had not been blinded in combat. During a drunken stunt with a live grenade, he tried to impress younger officers. The grenade exploded. The other officer survived, but Frank was permanently blinded, and his family never forgot his responsibility. Randy's words cut deeply, because they struck Frank's greatest source of shame. Frank had no honest defense, because the cruelty was built around painful truth. Years of buried rage rose inside him and erupted all at once. Like a wounded animal, Frank grabbed Randy by the throat. Only Charlie's repeated pleas finally made him let go. Frank may have wanted a final farewell, but the visit became one more bitter confrontation. The family's anger deepened his shame and isolation. Before leaving, he quietly said goodbye to his brother. The words sounded painfully final. Charlie could hear Frank slipping deeper into despair. The following morning, Charlie heard movement in Frank's room. When he entered, he was horrified to find Frank handling his service pistol with practiced precision. Blindness had not erased his military muscle memory. The speed and certainty of his movements terrified Charlie. This was no empty threat. Frank's plan was real and immediate. Charlie tried to reach Karen, who was away for Thanksgiving. The moment he looked away, Frank moved with startling speed, snatched the note from his hand, and stuffed it into his mouth. Charlie felt trapped and powerless. He announced that he was leaving, even if it cost him the promised pay. He would find his own way back to Baird. As he turned toward the door, Frank called after him and asked him to stay one more day. Charlie agreed on one condition. Frank had to surrender the ammunition. To keep Charlie there, Frank reluctantly handed over the magazine. Frank could not understand why Charlie still refused to abandon him. Charlie's answer was simple. He would not leave someone in immediate danger. That answer forced Frank to see that Charlie's concern was genuine. This was not a performance or some twisted lesson for the boy. Frank truly intended to die, and Charlie was the only person refusing to leave. Frank was equally baffled by Charlie's moral stand. He could not understand why the student held so fiercely to principle and refused to identify the pranksters. To Frank's cynical mind, cooperation would protect Charlie and open the door to Harvard. It seemed like the obvious practical choice. Charlie still refused to trade away his conscience. He would not inform for personal gain. Charlie believed George would also stay silent. silent. Frank knew privilege would change that calculation. George could rely on his father. Charlie could not. Trask did not need to buy George's cooperation, because George already had powerful protection. Frank again urged Charlie to take the deal, but Charlie again refused. Neither a threat nor a reward could make him sell his conscience. Later, in the cotillion room at the Pierre, Frank noticed a woman sitting alone. Her voice and scent drew his attention. As Charlie described her black dress, the woman was Donna, waiting for a man named Michael. She traced the rim of her glass while waiting. Frank approached confidently, though Donna remained cautious. Around the two strangers, Frank began with easy confidence. He identified the scent of Ogilvy Sisters soap, not an expensive perfume. The detail caught Donna by surprise. Frank then asked whether she knew the tango. Donna admitted that she had always wanted to learn, but had never found the chance. Michael had no interest in dancing. Frank offered to teach her then and there. Donna worried she might make a mistake. Frank told her that mistakes were allowed in tango, because partners could recover and keep moving with the music. The idea reassured her. Frank held out his hand, and Donna agreed to dance. Charlie guided them onto the floor, then watched Frank, led through rhythm, memory, and trust in his partner. For a few minutes, Frank looked fully alive. When the music ended, the room burst into applause. Frank then tried to draw Charlie into the conversation. He joked that the boy could sing and dance, but at that moment, Donna's date finally arrived, and hurried her off to meet his friends. The encounter ended quickly, but Charlie had witnessed a graceful, joyful side of Frank. The tango proved that Frank could still connect with someone. Night settled over New York, as the city lights came alive. Following Frank's arrangements, Manny drove him to meet Sophia, the woman Frank had hired for the night. Left alone, Charlie called George from the limousine. George was leaving with his family by helicopter. He had already gone to his father. Frank's prediction had come true. George had chosen family protection, and no longer promised to face the hearing beside Charlie. Charlie waited in the limousine. Eventually, the driver dozed off. Frank eventually returned from seeing Sophia, but the night had done nothing to ease his crisis. His posture and voice revealed even deeper emptiness. The luxury and intimacy he had pursued had offered only a brief distraction. Once the experience ended, his despair returned, heavier than before. By the following afternoon, Charlie opened the hotel room door, and found Frank emotionally exhausted on the bed, with almost every wish completed. The emptiness felt unbearable. Frank told Charlie to take the money and leave. Charlie refused to ignore the danger. Trying to awaken Frank's interest in life, he reminded him of the Ferrari. At the word Ferrari, Frank immediately came alive. The two headed straight to a nearby dealership. Every car inside promised speed and freedom. They walked past rows of gleaming sports cars, until they stopped at a brilliant red Ferrari. When they asked for a test drive, the salesman initially refused. Eventually, Frank used charm, rank, and cash to persuade him to hand over the keys. At last, Frank sat inside the car of his dreams. The red Ferrari turned heads the moment it reached the street. The engine roared around them, but riding as a passenger was not enough. Frank wanted to feel in control again. Charlie hoped the car might lift his spirit. Then Frank demanded the wheel. Charlie reluctantly changed seats, and stayed beside him to guide the drive. Frank accelerated recklessly. He relied on Charlie's warnings. As the car tore through the street, at a dangerously high speed, they narrowly avoided traffic and obstacles. The drive was illegal and extraordinarily dangerous. Even if it briefly made Frank feel powerful, Charlie feared they would crash. For a moment, Frank laughed freely again. They raced through the neighborhood, swept up in the car's speed. The reckless drive soon drew the attention of a police officer. When the officer pulled them over, Charlie panicked. He feared what would happen if the officer discovered that Frank could not see. But Frank remained remarkably composed. During the questioning, he bluffed well enough to avoid immediate arrest. Once the excitement faded, Frank's mood collapsed again. He stepped off the curb without waiting, and walked directly into moving traffic. Cars passed dangerously close, while Frank made no effort to protect himself. It was another act of self-destruction. Overwhelmed by despair, he finally collapsed onto the pavement. Charlie still refused to abandon him. Back at the hotel, Frank acted as though he only wanted to rest alone. The sudden calm alarmed Charlie. More suspiciously, Frank sent him several blocks away to buy a particular cigar. At first, Charlie followed the request. He headed toward the shop, but by the time he reached the lobby, a wave of dread came over him. Something was clearly wrong, so he turned around at once. When Charlie reopened the door, he found Frank dressed in his old military uniform. His service pistol was ready nearby. Charlie realized Frank had hidden ammunition from him. Fear and grief struck Charlie at once. He moved slowly toward Frank, hoping to get the weapon away. This time, however, Frank turned the threat toward Charlie. In the unbearable silence, Frank demanded to know why Charlie still refused to leave him. Charlie would not give him that escape. When the boy stayed firm, Frank began counting down, and the crisis reached its breaking point. Charlie understood the danger, and lunged forward to stop him. Frank was physically stronger, and the two struggled desperately. He pinned Charlie against the furniture. Years of despair finally poured out. Frank believed he had lost everything that mattered. Blindness, isolation, and shame had erased his future. He still longed for a woman's closeness, but believed no one could truly choose him. Charlie grew desperate as well. He told Frank he would have to kill him too. Frank had learned to live without sight, and retained confidence, intelligence, and skill, but none of it had cured his loneliness. He finally admitted that what he wanted most was not one perfect final night, but a woman who would hold him, and remain through ordinary life. Charlie rejected that hopeless conclusion. He reminded Frank of everything he could still do. Frank had danced the tango, driven a Ferrari, and made Donna trust him. He could still bring life into a room, and he still mattered to Charlie. Charlie's words reached the part of Frank that still wanted to live. At last, Frank softened. His life did not have to end there. The confrontation did not cure his depression, but it gave him a reason to put the weapon down and survive the night. Charlie promised no easy future. He simply refused to leave, while Frank remained in immediate danger. That persistence allowed the crisis to begin subsiding. Once the immediate danger passed, their bond became stronger and more honest. They prepared to leave New York and return to Baird. On the journey back, Frank sensed Charlie's anxiety again. Charlie admitted George had broken their agreement. Just as Frank predicted, George had sought his father's protection. The hearing would soon force Charlie to make his choice in public. He felt isolated and powerless. Back at Baird, Charlie received the pay he had earned. Before parting, Frank gently touched Charlie's face, a quiet gesture of recognition and gratitude. He wanted to remember the young man who had refused to leave him in danger. On the day of the hearing, Trask assembled the entire student body for a public disciplinary proceeding. George arrived beside his powerful father. Charlie had no parent or advocate with him. Then, without warning, Frank entered the hall, with Manny guiding him inside. Trask challenged his right to intervene. Frank introduced himself as retired Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade, and declared that he represented Charlie's parents. Then he took the empty seat beside Charlie. For the first time, Charlie had an adult openly standing with him. Trask resumed the hearing, and called George to speak. George carefully performed uncertainty. He said he had not been wearing his contact lenses, and that the darkness made identification difficult. Under repeated questioning, he eventually supplied 3 names, while protecting himself with phrases like maybe and I think. Then he left Charlie to confirm the accusation. Trask turned to Charlie. Charlie held to his decision, and refused to confirm the names. Trask increased the pressure, but Charlie still would not bend. His quiet resolve only angered Trask further. Harry, Trent, and Jimmy had never stepped forward themselves. Charlie was not protecting dear friends. He was refusing to sell information in exchange for personal advantage. At last, Trask declared that Charlie's silence made him unworthy of Baird and worthy of expulsion. At the same time, he praised George for cooperating with the school. Frank rose and tore into that double standard. Baird was punishing integrity, he argued, while rewarding cowardice protected by privilege. The students responded, because his words exposed the gulf between Baird's ideals and its conduct. The disciplinary committee considered the case, and announced its decision. Charlie was excused from any further testimony, and would not be expelled. Harry, Trent, and Jimmy were placed on probation. George received no praise for naming them. The auditorium erupted in applause. The students were not celebrating the prank. They were applauding courage and integrity. Frank and Charlie left the hall together. The ordeal had transformed the way each saw the other. For Charlie, Frank was now the adult willing to stand beside him in public. For Frank, Charlie had become a reason to keep living. Just then, Christine Downs, a political science teacher, approached them him after the hearing. She thanked Frank for defending the values Baird claimed to teach. Frank answered with his familiar charm, and asked whether she was married. The question caught Christine off guard. He also recognized the fragrance she was wearing. Their conversation was brief, warm, and lightly flirtatious. It suggested Frank was willing to connect with someone again. The film never confirms that a relationship followed. What mattered was Frank's renewed interest in life. Christine walked away smiling. Later, the limousine brought Frank back to Karen's house and stopped at the curb. Frank turned and gave Charlie a genuine smile. He asked Charlie to visit again before flying home for Christmas. Before Charlie could fully express his gratitude, Frank turned toward the house and walked back to his family. Charlie watched him go with quiet appreciation. Then Charlie returned to the limousine. As the car pulled away, he reflected on everything they had survived together. Frank had once kept everyone at a distance. Now he greeted the children instead of pushing them away. It was a small but meaningful sign that he was willing to rejoin family life. 2 days had changed both of them. Trask had offered Charlie Harvard while threatening him with expulsion, making self-interest look like the safest path. Charlie instead refused to sell out other students and preserved the dignity still under his control. Wealthy classmates could rely on powerful families. Charlie could rely only on a conscience he refused to bend. Frank had been trapped in darkness, cut off from his family, unable to see, and convinced death was his only escape. His obsession with women and fast cars was really an attempt to hold on to life. Charlie's uncompromising decency pulled Frank back from the edge. The boy's steadfast companionship helped him find a reason to continue. Frank's defense at the hearing never excused the prank. It defended conscience against institutional power. The world often teaches people to compromise and measure every choice by personal gain. But what matters most is the courage not to betray oneself and not to abandon another person in pain. Life can force people toward impossible choices. Some trade principle for opportunity, others surrender to despair. Charlie and Frank show that wealth and opportunity can vanish, while dignity, loyalty, and the grace of saving each other can carry people through their darkest moments.